now I'm actually on the clock, so the lightning talk begins. So I'll skip this first slide. So if we're going to talk about quality apps, we need to figure out how do you figure out what are the virtues of a high quality app? If we can't define it, if we can't know what they are, what's our target? So I'll use that as sort of a benchmark. And some of these you can actually measure and monitor and know factually, and other things are more anecdotal, and I'll tell you which ones are which. So the first thing, and maybe the most obvious thing, is that high quality apps are stable and they prevent regression. So you know how it is when you publish a new version of your app and you didn't test it fully, and you end up with, backlash on the market, a bunch of lousy ratings. It turns out we did sort of a textual analysis of ratings on the market, and half of them have to do with stability issues, so it crashed, or it just, ANRs, things like that. So this is, like I was mentioning before, this is kind of endemic to Android as a platform, is that we generally can see, at least from ratings, that we don't test our apps enough. So that's why Firebase provides Firebase Test Lab for Android. Now, I will mention Firebase is cross-platform. It's Android, iOS, and web, where it makes sense. Android and iOS are first-class citizens of the Firebase platform, except for Test Lab. We only do Android right now. We would like to do iOS later. But since this is an Android conference, it doesn't matter, right? So with Firebase Test Lab for Android, this is a tool you use during development. So you're basically proactively trying to discover bugs ahead of time. You can discover errors before they affect your users. We're trying to prevent these one-star ratings. No, I actually didn't say. Firebase Test Lab is, you can think of it as racks and racks of actual physical devices that you can test your app on. So in no way does any Android developer have enough devices to cover the broad spectrum. I mean, you might have your own rack of devices, and you have to worry about maintaining it, purchasing them, and all that. That's costly. Instead, you can do cloud testing, and that's what Firebase Test Lab for Android is. And you can do instrumentation tests. So if you've written your own test, that you use Espresso or Robodium or one of those other frameworks. You can run your instrumentation tests on that, on as many devices as you choose if you're a paying customer. Or you can do an automated test, which is what we call a robo test. This is different from a monkey test. If you know monkeys just like randomly pressing things. Robo's intelligent. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. That's not important for this particular point. But with Firebase Test Lab, with every test run, on every test you choose, or on every device, on every configuration you choose, you will get logs, like complete device logs. You'll get screenshots, you'll get videos, and you'll get a list of any crashes that have happened. And this all comes in like a final web report. So when the test is done, you can go to a website, basically the Firebase console, and look at that. You can also get metadata for that. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. With Firebase Test Lab, we didn't want people to have to learn a new tool to use it. This should integrate into your daily development flow. So it works with the tools you know. You don't really have to learn anything new. So if you're an existing Firebase user, you know that you have the Firebase web interface. It's super easy. You just push a button, upload your APK, and off a test goes. It really couldn't be any easier. Since Android Studio 2.0, there's been integration. So if you know how to create a run configuration is what happens when you push the run button, right? You can select to deploy to Test Lab directly, run on all the devices that you want, and get the test results back in Android Studio directly. So you don't really have to learn anything new. You just have to learn how to create that run configuration. There's also a CLI. So for those of you doing continuous integration, like with Jenkins, the CLI is a way to give you the ability to kick off a Test Lab run without having to do any sort of other special integrations. Now, I wouldn't run tests normally on the command line. The command line is like kind of unwieldy, and there's a lot of stuff to type. But it's great for continuous integration where you type it once and you just run it with each build. There's also a way to run tests in the Play Store Developer Console. So if anyone, some of you may have already seen this. This has been an offering for a while. If you upload your APK to an alpha or beta channel, even if you don't have any users, you'll get a free 5-minute robo test with that. So it'll run on a decent variety of devices, and you'll get the output of a robo test, which, like I said, is an automated test. So an automated test, well, how does that actually work? What is, how do you automate a test? Well, we have special software that's intelligent. It looks for different UI widgets in your app, and we'll push them. It will basically systematically try to scan your app in the same way that Google might scan your website looking for links and things like that. So you really don't write any lines of code. This happens automatically. And it's pretty neat to see how it does its thing. At the end of the test, you'll actually get a test map. You can see how actually it navigated your apps. You can see exactly where things are going wrong. Now, if you're thinking oh, RoboTest sounds great, but I actually do need to write tests, but you hate writing tests, who here likes to write tests? Yeah, oh, one. Okay, good. So I'm not talking to you right now. I'm talking to everyone else who hates to write tests. Android Studio, as of 2.2, has something called the Espresso Test Recorder. So under the Run menu, you do Record Espresso Test. You just run, it'll launch your app on your device. You use the app on the device, and it will write the test code to verify what happened. And so this is great because you basically eliminate all that boilerplate. You're basically creating the boilerplate and then maybe tweaking it later. So take advantage of this if you haven't yet. It's a great way to get started with testing. So high-quality apps, I think, are functional across a variety of devices. And we know this on Android, right? Your users have chosen whatever device that they want, right? There's a bunch of them, and that's good. I actually like that about the Android platform. You have small devices, big devices. You can use them in any sort of portrait, portrait or landscape. Maybe the bad thing is there's so many different API levels, but the variety of devices itself is a good thing. So when you're doing your Android app, you probably want to have a slightly different UI in each situation, right? So you have your large device, your tablet UI probably should be different than the small device layout. And again, with Firebase Test Lab, you can do this. You can select all these different configurations and run automatically. And if you have a QA team or whoever's looking at this can examine the screenshots of your results and find out, does the tablet UI actually look like a tablet UI? Is this sane for my configuration? So definitely take advantage of that. Now, one thing with Firebase Test Lab is that we're committed to increasing the device coverage. So actually later this week, we're going to make some announcements about that. We're going to, I think, essentially double the number of different device models we have available in our lab, which is great because you need to be able to test against the devices your users are actually using. So when a new device, a new Galaxy, whatever comes out, you need to be able to use that, right? You need to be able to test on that if you don't want to buy it yourself. So I think high-quality apps are continually monitored in production. So once you've shipped your app, you've tested your app, you think it works fine, that's great. There's always something that slips through the cracks. That's just a practical reality is that there's no such thing as a bug-free app unless your app is one activity that prints something to a text view. And that's hard to get wrong, but practically speaking, for complicated apps, there's no such thing as a bug-free app. So you need to know about the things that you've missed, or about the things that your users have discovered that you didn't discover simply because they're using your app in a way that you didn't predict. So we have Firebase Crash Reporting for that. So Firebase Crash Reporting is a tool you use in production. So unlike Test Lab, which you use in development, you use Crash Reporting in production, and you're reacting to any crashes that you may that your users may encounter. And again, you get full reports of this. This is what you expect from any crash reporting tools, that will group crashes by similarity, so by stat trace, and then let you drill into that and look at the individual devices and look for patterns and logs and things to help reproduce the crash from what you've observed. And I think what's pretty unique about Firebase Crash Reporting is that it's integrated with Firebase Analytics. And I won't spend too much time talking about analytics, but it's a full-fledged mobile analytics platform. Crashes in your app essentially become events that are reported to analytics. So, like first open is an event, or in-app purchase is an event, or, you can define custom events. Well, a crash becomes an event just like anything else in analytics, and you can use that in a funnel analysis to figure out, is a crash actually impacting your flows? Are your critical conversion events being impacted by crashes? And you can know that with Firebase Analytics. So with Crash Reporting, you get a dashboard. For many people, this is like a daily destination to figure out how healthy is my app. So you kind of get this overtime health view, which I think is very handy. We're spending a lot of effort into making this even easier to use than it is now. There's also going to be, I can't remember if there is or if there's going to be a mobile view, so you can track your crashes and track your diagnostics on the go, which is pretty important. Now, I mentioned before, between Firebase Test Lab and Crash Reporting, you have a flow, or at least we intend for there to be a flow. So in development, you obviously want to use Test Lab to daily check the health of your app, right? For a lot of people, in fact, some of our bigger customers, like American Express, send every build to Firebase Test Lab for testing, right? And they have a comprehensive suite of tests that take many, many minutes to run. So when you're done in development, you might push that to an alpha or beta channel. And again, with the Play Store, you get a free test in alpha and beta. You can think of that like your very first alpha customer or your very first beta customer. That test kind of represents the first person who gets a hold of your app when it comes from the Play Store. And of course, in beta, you might have actual users who are experiencing crashes, and that goes in and reinforms your development, right? So if you find a crash, you might write a new test test it in test lab, then republish again. And then when you're happy with everything that you've done in development in alpha and beta, you can push to production, and then crash reporting is the tool that you'll depend on there. So this is kind of how we see, in a very simplistic sense, how the two tools work together. So high-quality apps are deeply concerned about total UX. And this is kind of like the soft edge of app quality. You can't really measure it except in the sense of like how your users are sentimentally feeling about your app, right? And if you're an Android developer, you've probably seen this before. If you haven't seen this before, you're not an Android developer, you can leave the room now. The rest of us know this very well. And I think this dialogue is actually kind of funny because it's saying, unfortunately, something happened. Yes, it's unfortunate. My only option as a user is to be okay with it. That's all you can do is say okay, which is like forcing the user into something that they really strongly disagree with, right? So you say okay, and you don't really mean okay, and it's terrible, right? So hopefully if you're using crash reporting, you'll get a record of that. But a lot of times what happens is you get a review like this, right? This is a review. It's not really a review. So what's happening here is we have an unhappy user who rates the app 1 star, and they say crashes on category select, and they give you a little diagnostic. Now, again, this isn't a review. This is a feedback channel, right? Someone here is using the Play Store as a way to try to communicate to you what's gone wrong, which is kind of an abuse of the Play Store. But unfortunately, at least going way back in Android history, when I mentioned the typical 1 star review is force close uninstall, right? That's all they say. You need to stop those, right? These are the 50% of reviews that are causing problems for Android developers. So I think it's good to just prevent these altogether. Now, if a user knows that you know that there's a crash in a particular part of the app, I think they're less likely to go to the market to try to tell you, right? If they know you know, they're just waiting it out, right? So what you can do is use Firebase notifications to broadcast your knowledge of a severe bug to your users. So with Firebase notifications, again, it's a direct channel from you to your users. If you find a crash and you know something is serious, send a message and say, we acknowledge it. I'm sorry, promise that fix. Like on a time, give them a timeline. In a couple weeks, we'll have this fixed. You can even offer credits, right? You can do something to help your users feel more comfortable with the fact that you know you're working on it and it will be fixed. And I think, this is my opinion, that it will stop those sort of crazy 1 star reviews that don't mean anything, right? They're just them trying to tell you something. Yeah, so let's see. High quality apps also, I think, will react quickly to issues as they occur. So I talked about with crash reporting, when you know there's a crash, that's great, you can act on it, but practically speaking, it can take days to turn around a fix, right? So you have to code it up, you send it through your test suite, you submit it to the store, then there's an approval, well, on iOS at least, there's an approval process, which itself can take a week or two, right? You can't turn around on a bug fix very quickly. What if you could turn around a bug fix, or at least a rollback, very quickly? So Firebase offers a tool called Remote Config, and among all of the many things it can be used for, one thing you can do with it is use it to plan and stage rollouts of new features. So if you want to push something new, but you don't want to have to publish a reversion in case there's a problem, use Remote Config to create a switch. You can think of it as an on-off switch, right? So a feature is off when you publish it, then use Remote Config on the server, turn it on, and your users will see it instantly, right? And so what you can do is then, if you have a problem and you know that it's causing a problem for enough people, turn it off. Start out with a small number of people. And at Google, we call that a canary, right? Use the canary in the coal mine analogy to test on a small number of users with Remote Config, gradually bump that up over time, and if there's a problem, just turn it off, right? And then fix it offline, so that you can basically prevent those crazy 1 star ratings that don't really help. Let's see, high quality apps earn more revenue. Now maybe this is obvious, right? Of course, if you have a high quality app, you're going to have more users, you're going to make more money. That's kind of why we're all here, right? Is to make money from application development. The classic way to try to make more money is to test to see what users like more. So you might do what you call an A/B test. You have 2 slightly different experiences. One, maybe you're testing early login versus late login. So you don't require login until later. You want to find out, does that affect my revenue? Does that affect retention? Does that affect my key metrics? So you would want to experimentally figure that out. You don't want to guess. You want to know based on how your users actually use your app. So with Remote Config, you can perform these experiments. Now, the great thing is remote config is tied directly into analytics. And again, I'm alluding to analytics being sort of like this thing that I'm not going to tell you about, but that's there. It's actually a very core part of the Firebase platform. It ties into a lot of the components and lets you understand how they're working together. So when you perform this experiment, you want to go into analytics and figure out among users in my A group and my B group, who's spending more money, or who's converting better, or who is staying in my app longer. That's ultimately what you want to know. High-quality apps feel snappy and work well when offline, and this is something that is classically very difficult to do. So with traditional application architecture, you might have a SQL database, and you issue queries to that SQL database, and then you don't have anything to show until you have the result of that. Then you can maybe cache it, and then you have to write caching code. You have this persistence layer. It's a lot of work. I would recommend don't do that anymore. Instead, what you can use is Firebase real-time database. Now, this is the classic Firebase, right? This is the real-time database that has been around since 2013 and people are still using today. It has a very different model than SQL databases because SQL databases depend on this request-response mechanism. And if you want to get the freshest data, you have to keep issuing queries. But the way Firebase works is as data is pushed into your database, it's automatically distributed out to the clients. And it works using listeners, right? So you don't ever really issue a query and wait for a response. You declare what data you're interested in, set up a listener on that data, on that path, or on that node in the database, and then that listener will continue to get called as the data changes. Now this is great because you give the user that sort of like instant response feel. So the classic example of an app is like a chat app, right? Where you have a lot of people pushing chat messages into a room, and those messages are getting constantly pulled out by everyone who's in there. This is a great way to make the user feel like they're getting the latest thing. They're always on top of it. They don't have like a pull to refresh. Like eliminate pull to refresh. It's a neat pattern if you need that, but with Firebase real-time database, you don't need pull to refresh anymore. You simply listen for updates as they happen, and you just respond to that. Now, one thing that's important to know is that there's local persistence when you enable it, which is great because as you listen to data, if you have persistence enabled, that goes into a local database, right? You don't deal with that database directly. You simply continue to listen to that location, and you will get the cached data. So your application will actually work very well offline. All that data that you've pulled down up to, I think the cache size is 10 megabytes, all of that data, you can continue to listen to it and act as if it's still live. The user doesn't have to know that they've lost or regained connectivity. They don't have to sit in front of spinners all the time. They can still use the app while offline. This is great because actually I talked to someone at Go North. They were it's a startup creating apps for construction workers. And a lot of time construction workers would have to go into like a concrete poured basement. They would lose connectivity, but they still needed to have their to-do list. And so using Firebase real-time database, it was like a godsend for them to not have to write all that syncing code. And they tried, and it was actually very difficult. And so they said, we want to abandon that. We want to use real-time database because it solves our problem very well. So what else do we need to know? I think that's it. I'm going to end early. I know I said I was going to do a lightning talk in 25 minutes. I think I went under, which is fine. I spent all that time talking before. But thank you. Thank you for being here and listening.